On February 14, 1943, exactly 18,000 feet above Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, Japanese naval aviation confronted a formidable new machine that would methodically dismantle their aerial dominance across the Pacific theater. Sporting a deep sea blue finish and an instantly recognizable inverted gull-wing design, this heavy American interceptor executed a vertical ascent that completely shattered everything Imperial pilots fundamentally understood about the physics of aerial combat. As the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the deeply revered pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, violently shuddered while struggling to maintain its maximum operational ceiling, the newly arrived adversary effortlessly surged past 20,000 feet, then 22,000. Continuously ascending with an abundance of engine power held in reserve. You are looking at the Vought F4U Corsair, a brutal instrument of war destined to earn the terrifying moniker of whistling death due to the chilling, high-pitched shriek generated by its wing root oil coolers during steep attack dives. Over the ensuing 18 months, this specific airframe would inflict profound psychological trauma upon the elite pilot corps of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service, delivering crushing displays of technical supremacy that obliterated every tactical doctrine they had painstakingly honed since 1937. That Valentine's Day skirmish represented far more than a routine dogfight. It heralded the explosive dawn of an inescapable technological hegemony that reduced Japan's most seasoned aviators from apex predators to vulnerable prey, forcing them to actively flee the airspace the moment they caught sight of those distinctive, bent wings. To truly grasp the psychological ruin that the Corsair inflicted upon the enemy, you must first appreciate the absolute, supreme confidence possessed by Japanese naval aviators during the early months of 1943. These men were the hardened, elite survivors of the most brutally selective aviation pipeline on the planet. Given that the Okaren Naval Aviator Preparatory Course admitted fewer than 2% of all hopeful applicants, those exceptionally rare individuals fortunate enough to be chosen endured 3 grueling years of instruction, a curriculum so intensely unforgiving that it routinely claimed more candidate lives in training accidents than American forces lost during several major combat engagements. By 1943, an average Japanese carrier aviator boasted well over 800 hours strapped inside a cockpit, while countless seasoned veterans of the Chinese theater possessed flight logs exceeding 2,000 hours, having revolutionized maritime warfare at Pearl Harbor, shocked British forces at Ceylon, and utterly commanded the skies from Burma all the way to the Gilbert Islands. Throughout 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero maintained an astonishing 12-to-1 kill ratio against Allied interceptors, propelled by master pilots who had perfected energy management tactics to ruthlessly exploit their airframe's unmatched maneuverability, extraordinary flight range, and flawless canopy visibility. The Zero could easily outturn any Allied combat plane, vastly outdistance all potential opponents, and, when piloted by a seasoned veteran, felt entirely invincible in the hostile skies. Forged through 6 brutal years of relentless conflict in China, the primary fighter doctrine of the Japanese Navy prioritized exceptional individual marksmanship and highly aggressive maneuvers, fundamentally preaching that the warrior's Bushido spirit would inevitably conquer any physical or material shortcomings. Because this deeply ingrained philosophy had repeatedly triumphed against Chinese defenders, British Hawker Hurricanes, American Curtiss P-40s, and Grumman F-4F Wildcats, every successive victory only hardened their absolute conviction that human spirit and pilot skill would always surpass heavy armor and advanced technology. When the Corsair initially appeared in the Solomon Islands sector, Japanese commanders dismissively viewed it as merely another clumsy American attempt to defeat the hyper-agile Zero through sheer, unrefined brute force. On February 12, 1943, Marine Fighting Squadron 124, officially designated as VMF-124, deployed the very first 12 Vought F4U Corsairs to the dusty, embattled airstrips of Guadalcanal. Imperial reconnaissance crews immediately documented the new fighter's unmistakable physical profile, carefully noting the severe inverted gull wings, the colossal four-bladed propeller assembly, and the incredibly elongated nose section stretching far ahead of the pilot's seat. Their inaugural baptism by fire unfolded on February 14th, when these fresh fighters escorted Patrol Bomber 4Y1 Liberators, abbreviated as PB-4Y1, on a heavy bombing raid targeting the Kahili airfield on Bougainville. This initial engagement was subsequently dubbed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre because it initially proved catastrophic for the American forces, resulting in the tragic loss of 9 Allied aircraft in exchange for only a single destroyed Zero. Despite taking heavy Allied casualties, that explosive initial clash exposed a terrifying new reality to the Imperial aviators, clearly revealing that these heavy American machines possessed revolutionary performance metrics that permanently altered the fundamental dynamics of aerial warfare. Rather than getting drawn into the traditional looping, turning dogfights where the Zero historically excelled, the Corsairs deliberately ascended high above their adversaries, a distinct vertical feat no prior American fighter had successfully achieved, and unleashed devastating, high-velocity diving assaults. They masterfully leveraged their staggering kinetic energy advantage to immediately disengage and sprint away, long before the Japanese aviators could physically react, immediately entering a steep zoom climb back to a dominant combat altitude where they remained completely impervious to any retaliatory pursuit. As Imperial intelligence slowly pieced together the classified technical specifications of the F4U Corsair, the resulting data highlighted a completely insurmountable capability gap between the two warring factions' aviation technology. The American interceptor was propelled by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp power plant that generated a staggering 2,000 horsepower upon takeoff, while a specialized water injection system could temporarily boost that explosive output to 2,250 horsepower during intense combat scenarios. In stark contrast, the Nakajima Sakai 21 engine, housed within the Zero, struggled to produce 1,130 horsepower, clearly indicating that the new American threat belonged to an entirely different, heavily advanced category of aerospace machinery. This shocking disparity was most glaringly obvious in maximum sustained velocity, as the Corsair easily maintained 417 miles per hour at an altitude of 19,900 feet, whereas the Mitsubishi Zero Model 52, Japan's premier 1943 variant, topped out at a mere 351 miles per hour. Furthermore, diving engagements became utterly terrifying for the Imperial pilots, because while the heavy Corsairs routinely surpassed 500 miles per hour or retaining crisp aerodynamic control, the fragile Zeros suffered severe control surface flutter at 360 miles per hour and faced catastrophic structural disintegration if pushed anywhere beyond 410. The comparative ascent metrics proved equally demoralizing to the Japanese high command, as the Corsair could rocket to a sheer elevation of 20,000 feet in exactly 7.7 minutes. It effortlessly maintained a standard vertical climb rate of 2,890 feet per minute, which could be violently increased to 3,210 feet per minute by engaging the engine's war emergency power, whereas the aging Zero required a grueling 11 minutes to haul its frame to that exact same altitude. Once the swirling dogfight breached 25,000 feet, the American airframe remained highly energetic and lethally responsive to the stick, while the oxygen-starved Japanese fighter wallowed sluggishly through the thin atmosphere, becoming dangerously unresponsive to pilot inputs. Ultimately, the Corsair's official operational service ceiling of 36,900 feet might as well have been deep outer space to the Imperial aviators, whose radically outclassed machines desperately gasped for atmospheric lift anywhere above 33,000 feet. Beyond raw engine performance and altitude capabilities, the sheer disparity in ballistic firepower proved to be the ultimate psychological sledgehammer that completely broke the morale of the Imperial squadrons. The Corsair was heavily armed with 6 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, each relentlessly spitting 850 armor-piercing rounds per minute at a blistering muzzle velocity of 2,840 feet per second. This lethal configuration allowed the American pilot to hurl an astonishing 69 pounds of kinetic metal at the enemy target every single second he firmly held down the firing trigger. By direct comparison, the standard Zero's defensive suite of 2 7.7mm machine guns and twin 20mm cannons could only muster a pathetic combined output of 13 pounds per second. And because those heavy cannons only held 60 shells per barrel, a Japanese pilot would completely exhaust his primary offensive ammunition in just 7 fleeting seconds of aerial combat. You will find the Japanese aviators quickly realized the F4U Corsair was practically invincible when contrasted with their own unprotected Mitsubishi Zeros. Encased around the pilot station was 155 pounds of solid plating, complemented by self-sealing gasoline receptacles and fortified oil temperature regulators. Munitions that typically obliterated a Zero would simply puncture a Corsair, allowing these resilient machines to frequently limp back to the airstrip, bearing hundreds of bullet wounds. Consequently, this extraordinary durability completely revolutionized the fundamental nature of aerial engagements. Because their machines pardoned miscalculations, United States airmen were empowered to adopt exceptionally aggressive and sometimes careless combat tactics. Conversely, Imperial flyers operated under a terrifying reality where a single tactical blunder guaranteed immediate destruction, as they were afforded zero defensive shielding. To attain its mythic agility, the Zero was engineered to be as featherweight as physically achievable, which meant completely sacrificing protective plating, self-repairing fuel storage, and any superfluous structural integrity. However, the Corsair demonstrated how the overwhelming industrial might of the United States successfully negated the traditional drawbacks of heavy defensive outfitting. American engineers designed power plants possessing such tremendous thrust that they could effortlessly haul heavy shielding or simultaneously dominating unarmored adversaries in the sky. Ultimately, they forged warbirds capable of enduring pilot errors, mechanical breakdowns, and fortunate enemy strikes, safeguards that Imperial aviators could only dream of possessing. Rabaul, the formidable Japanese stronghold situated in the Southwest Pacific, ultimately served as the primary theater where the F4U systematically dismantled the Emperor's naval air forces. Within this heavily fortified installation, the most formidable Imperial garrison beyond the Japanese archipelago, the absolute elite of their fighter squadrons gathered in a desperate bid to halt the Allied offensive. By October 1943, when Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington deployed to the region alongside his VMF 214 Black Sheep Squadron and their F4U-1A Corsairs, the mental equilibrium of the enemy had already fractured. During this period, Imperial airmen entirely abandoned conversations of triumph, whispering instead only of mere survival. On December 17, 1943, Boyington commanded 31 Corsairs to shield a heavy bombing assault targeting Rabaul, prompting the defenders to scramble 40 Zeros piloted by their most skilled veterans. The American fighters ascended to 25,000 feet, an extreme elevation where the enemy machines profoundly struggled to operate effectively. As the Japanese attempted to climb and engage, the American aviators plummeted through the enemy formations at velocities nearing 450 miles per hour, unleashing devastatingly brief salvos before rocketing back to safety. Helpless to pursue, flee, or force a traditional dogfight, the defenders surrendered 11 aircraft while managing to only superficially damage a pair of Corsairs. You must understand that the sheer psychological dread generated by the Corsair extended far beyond its mere numerical combat statistics. The unique acoustic signature of the airframe transformed into a standalone instrument of psychological warfare against the enemy. Due to the placement of the oil cooler intakes within the wing roots, the fighter produced a haunting, unforgettable shrieking whistle whenever it plunged into a high-velocity dive. In fact, surviving Japanese airmen recounted being tormented by this terrifying noise in their nightmares, ultimately developing uncontrollable physical flinches whenever they encountered remotely comparable sounds in their daily lives. The intimidating visual design of the Corsair only served to magnify this pervasive atmosphere of dread among its adversaries, primarily due to its signature inverted gull wings that forged a menacing predatory profile. Compounding this brutal aesthetic was a massive propeller measuring 13 feet 4 inches across, the largest ever installed on a pursuit plane, which, alongside a deep Navy camouflage, rendered the aircraft practically undetectable against the ocean during steep descents. American flyers purposefully exploited these terrifying traits by intentionally executing steep intimidation plunges over enemy landing strips without discharging a single weapon, simply to broadcast that agonizing shriek. Additionally, units like Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron adorned their cowlings with snarling shark jaws to aggressively intensify this monstrous, inescapable persona. By the middle of 1943, the Imperial Command was confronted with a mathematically catastrophic predicament regarding their combat effectiveness. The relentless onslaught of the Corsair and similarly advanced American warplanes was slaughtering seasoned veterans at a rate drastically outpacing the Empire's ability to educate fresh recruits. Prior to the conflict, a Japanese naval aviator typically accumulated between 500 and 700 hours of rigorous flight instruction before ever seeing a combat zone. However, severe petroleum deficits and the destruction of educational aircraft slashed this preparation time to a mere 150 hours by 1943 and plummeting to an abysmal 40 to 60 hours by 1945. These final replacements were scarcely competent enough to keep their machines airborne, making them utterly defenseless against seasoned American aces. For the surviving veteran pilots, the psychological toll of this shifting dynamic was absolutely catastrophic to their morale. They found themselves partnered with hopelessly inexperienced rookies who stood zero chance of surviving an encounter with a Corsair, forcing the seasoned aces to helplessly witness their wingmen perish while attempting to shield them. Consequently, the time-honored tradition of senior pilots mentoring junior aviators completely disintegrated beneath the crushing pressure of unrelenting casualties. Those few experienced flyers who had clashed with the F4U in 1943 forecasted with chilling precision the absolute slaughter that would unfold once the United States Navy fully mobilized this devastating new generation of combat aircraft. This grim prophecy materialized during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, when F-6F Hellcats, utilizing the identical power plant and boasting comparable capabilities to the Corsair, validated those fears in an engagement the Americans famously dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. During this catastrophic clash, the Empire hemorrhaged approximately 400 to 450 aircraft, while the United States forfeited merely 130 machines. In fact, a vast multitude of the perished Japanese flyers never even caught a glimpse of their executioners, having been blown out of the sky by overwhelmingly superior predators they could neither outclimb nor outdive. The first-hand accounts of those who participated in these clashes vividly illustrate the profound psychological shift from imperial arrogance to unadulterated panic. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124, who achieved the milestone of becoming the initial Corsair ace on May 13, 1943, regularly recounted skirmishes where his adversaries appeared entirely impotent against his machine's capabilities. Securing 21 confirmed kills over a 6-month span, Walsh frequently asserted that the overwhelming superiority in velocity, ascent rate, armor plating, and ballistic output essentially rendered dogfighting an unjust contest. He observed that hunting Zeros devolved into a purely mechanical, repetitive procedure. Secure an altitude advantage, plunge through their ranks at insurmountable speeds, unleash a lethal barrage, rocket back to a secure elevation, and initiate the sequence once more. Further cementing this absolute aerial supremacy was the astonishing combat log of Lieutenant Robert Hansen, who eradicated 20 Japanese aircraft in a mere 17 days, spanning from January 14th to the 30th in 1944. Operating alongside VMF 215, Hansen weaponized his fighters' strengths so masterfully that entire enemy squadrons would instinctively scatter in sheer panic the moment they recognized the distinctive silhouette of approaching Corsairs. As the conflict dragged from 1943 into 1944, upgraded iterations of the aircraft exponentially expanded the already massive performance chasm between the warring nations. The F4U variant debuted an enhanced bubble canopy for superior situational awareness, alongside water injection systems for emergency thrust, while the F4U model could haul 4,000 pounds of explosives, surpassing the payload of many enemy bombers, yet still casually outmaneuver any Japanese interceptor, leaving the Empire's subsequent technological countermeasures looking like acts of profound desperation. Although designers upgraded the Zero Model 52 with defensive armor and self-sealing fuel lines, the resulting weight gain stripped away its legendary agility while failing to meaningfully improve its resilience. Concurrently, the recently introduced Kawanishi N1K George interceptor demonstrated significant potential, yet it was plagued by chronically failing hydraulic systems and unpredictable power plants. The battlefield dynamics grew even more horrifying during 1944, when 36 specially outfitted F4U night variants arrived in the theater, carrying APS-4 airborne radar systems. These nocturnal predators actively stalked Imperial aviators through the pitch-black sky, decisively violating the night, which had formerly served as their final safe haven, and completely obliterating whatever remained of their combat morale. This profound collapse in morale culminated during the latter half of 1944 with the desperate implementation of kamikaze operations, shifting their operational mindset from achieving martial triumph to simply securing an impactful demise, served as a stark, undeniable confession that their technological capabilities had been entirely surpassed. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, the architect behind these suicide squadrons, confidentially acknowledged that traditional dogfighting against advancing Hellcats and their superior counterparts was no longer a viable option. With the tactical kill-to-loss ratio soaring to a staggering 15-1, favoring United States aviators by the end of that year, Imperial Command concluded that sacrificing airmen directly into naval vessels was preferable to wasting their lives in utterly unwinnable aerial duels. Meanwhile, Allied aviators piloting these advanced interceptors racked up kill counts at an astonishing pace that would have been unimaginable back in 1942. For instance, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington claimed 22 of his total 26 aerial triumphs while flying the aircraft within a mere 84 days. Such extraordinary combat records stemmed heavily from an insurmountable engineering edge rather than purely raw talent, a grim reality that veteran Imperial airmen clearly comprehended as they watched enemy aces thrive on mechanical superiority rather than individual mastery. Consequently, the aircraft itself emerged as the decisive factor over the pilot's inherent ability, thoroughly upending the core philosophy that had historically defined Japan's aerial warfare doctrine. Ultimately, this formidable fighter embodied the absolute pinnacle of United States manufacturing capabilities, concentrated into a single, lethal platform. Facilities under VA aircraft rolled out 12,571 of these machines throughout the conflict, eclipsing the entire output of Japanese interceptor manufacturing between 1942 and 1945. Building just one unit required a staggering 13,000 pounds of aluminum, 1,000 pounds of steel, 18 miles of internal wiring, alongside 2,000 distinct mechanical components. At the heart of this behemoth sat the Pratt & Whitney R28000 power plant. Its 2,800 cubic inches of displacement, twin rows of 18 cylinders, and advanced supercharging mechanisms showcased precision tolerances so refined that Imperial engineers could never hope to replicate the technology, even if they managed to salvage an intact model. While the Imperial forces were forced to conscript barely trained adolescents to confront these mechanical monsters, the United States mobilized its training pipelines to forge new aviators with relentless, factory-like precision. Throughout the hostilities, the U.S. Navy successfully graduated 60,000 airmen, ensuring every single recruit logged 600 hours of aerial instruction, which included 200 hours specifically dedicated to mastering high-performance fighters. These freshly minted American pilots entered the Pacific Theater having expended vastly more ordnance during practice drills than their opponents typically fired throughout their entire combat careers, continuously refining their tactics by scrutinizing action reports and combat camera recordings. Conversely, the opposition's instructional programs utterly disintegrated, churning out recruits who possessed fewer than 100 hours of total stick time and who lacked any practical experience with live gunnery, stratospheric maneuvers, or maximum velocity descents. The threat expanded substantially in 1944 when the aircraft evolved into a dedicated fighter bomber, unleashing a fresh wave of devastation upon the theater. Outfitted with incendiary payloads, explosive rockets, and heavy munitions, these versatile warbirds ruthlessly dismantled naval vessels, logistical hubs, and runways, breeding immense strategic paranoia because they could strike anywhere without warning. Saburo Sakai, the most renowned surviving Imperial ace possessing 64 confirmed kills, candidly evaluated this overwhelming adversary in his later memoirs, noting that crossing paths with this machine signaled the inevitable loss of the war. He realized the true peril was not simply the individual plane itself, but the horrifying fact that American factories could mass-produce thousands of them, prompting seasoned veterans to immediately dive for cover or vanish into cloud banks upon spotting those distinctive inverted gull wings, knowing full well that engaging the enemy in an obsolete fighter equated to certain death. Entering the early months of 1945, the mathematical data painted a grim portrait of absolute decimation across the skies. The iconic bent-wing fighters secured 2,140 aerial kills, while suffering merely 189 combat casualties, yielding an impressive 11.3 to 1 dominance ratio. However, these figures barely capture the profound mental paralysis afflicting the opposition, as numerous enemy formations simply retreated upon contact. Countless planes were pulverized on the tarmac by roving squadrons, and many terrified aviators outright refused to launch when the American hunters were sighted. The ultimate humiliation manifested in the manufacturing output during 1945. While the United States generated 7,829 various pursuit craft, the crumbling Japanese infrastructure managed to assemble only 114, effectively proving that a single American assembly line could effortlessly outpace an entire enemy nation. This unprecedented aeronautical supremacy entirely fractured the bedrock of Japan's martial ethos, particularly the deeply ingrained belief in Yamato Damashi, the doctrine insisting that an indomitable spiritual resolve could conquer any materialistic disadvantage, was exposed as a hollow myth when confronted by such insurmountable engineering prowess, rendering a pilot's individual mastery utterly irrelevant. Even the most seasoned veteran, flying an impeccably tuned aircraft, stood absolutely no chance against a moderately skilled adversary operating this advanced machinery. A bitter truth that demolished the core philosophy behind their combat training. The definitive testament to this dominance unfolded during the Battle of Okinawa between April and June of 1945, where these naval and marine aviators launched over 15,000 missions, from secured airstrips and escort vessels, claiming upwards of 500 airborne victories and dropping thousands of tons of munitions to secure absolute dominance over the skies. When you analyze the Pacific conflict, you immediately see that novice Japanese aviators, often possessing fewer than 30 hours of flight instruction, were subjected to systematic obliteration. The handful of individuals who survived these brief, terrifying clashes recounted battles that concluded in mere seconds, well before they could even align their weaponry with the approaching Corsairs. As the defense of the home islands loomed, you can understand how the terrifying prospect of countering thousands of these advanced fighters induced profound strategic paralysis among the high command. Planners in Tokyo estimated that United States forces could launch upwards of 5,000 Corsairs from naval vessels and secured airstrips, while their own military could only scrape together roughly 2,000 operational airframes of various, mostly antiquated models. Consequently, Admiral Sumu Toyota, who led the combined fleet, conceded that traditional aerial warfare was no longer viable, leaving the concealment of planes for kamikaze strikes as their sole remaining tactic. Ultimately, you can see how this formidable American aircraft rendered conventional dogfighting entirely obsolete for the Imperial Air Forces, though the deployment of atomic weapons in August 1945 prevented their absolute eradication. Had the conflict continued, Operation Olympic, the planned amphibious assault on Kyushu, would have unleashed more than 2,000 Corsairs, launching from 48 aircraft carriers and a dozen newly seized runways. Veterans of the Imperial Air Wings later expressed profound relief to investigators that they never had to face this apocalyptic scenario. To them, engaging such a massive, technologically superior armada would not have been a military engagement, but rather a swift and utter extermination. During the initial phases of the post-war occupation, American military authorities escorted former imperial commanders to inspect United States manufacturing facilities, which fundamentally shattered their remaining illusions. If you had observed operations alongside them at the VA plant in Connecticut, which was still continuously churning out Corsairs, you would understand how the staggering reality of American manufacturing capabilities was finally exposed to the defeated officers. They were astounded to learn that a solitary American facility manufactured more aviation engines than their entire nation combined, and that single states within the US eclipsed the whole Japanese empire in aluminum output. Standing before these endless assembly lines, the former naval leadership finally comprehended the sheer futility of their wartime strategy, realizing they had pitted a pre-industrial infrastructure against an industrial juggernaut that mass-produced unassailable aerial dominance. As you delve into the definitive operational data from the Pacific Theater, the statistics paint a vivid picture of this absolute mechanical subjugation. American manufacturing plants delivered 12,571 Corsairs, which ultimately claimed 2,140 aerial triumphs, while suffering merely 189 air-to-air defeats, yielding an astonishing kill ratio of 11.3 to 1. Throughout more than 64,000 combat sorties, these fighters delivered 15,621 tons of ordnance, utterly dominating the Zero, with a speed advantage of 66 miles per hour and a climb rate superiority exceeding 1,000 feet per minute. Furthermore, the aircraft boasted a diving speed edge of over 140 miles per hour, an altitude ceiling advantage of 3,900 feet, and delivered an overwhelming 530% more weight of fire. You also see this imbalance extending to production and logistics, with American facilities reaching a monthly peak of 418 units, compared to the 250 fighters of all models managed by the opposition, while United States aviators received 600 hours of instruction against the meager 40 to 60 hours afforded to their 1945 counterparts. Following the cessation of hostilities, defeated aviation engineers meticulously examined captured airframes, utilizing the fighters as diagnostic tools to measure the vast technological chasm their nation had fallen into. Every single component you look at, from the hydraulic mechanisms and electrical systems to the metallurgical composition and assembly methodologies, revealed a level of sophistication previously unimaginable to the imperial designers. Consequently, the profound lessons extracted from the very machine that had decimated their wartime squadrons heavily dictated the trajectory of Japanese aerospace engineering for subsequent decades. Conversely, you will find that the United States aviators operating these formidable machines harbored conflicted feelings regarding their absolute dominance, frequently noting that fighting poorly trained teenagers in obsolete planes felt more like a mechanized execution than honorable warfare. Rather than viewing themselves as chivalrous airborne knights, these pilots recognized they were essentially highly trained technicians managing an industrial slaughter, while their adversaries tragically brandished a spiritual warrior ethos against modern heavy machine guns. This relentless demonstration of airborne supremacy acted as a catalyst for profound post-war cultural shifts within the defeated nation, as the catastrophic failure of spiritual resolve against advanced engineering thoroughly dismantled their militaristic dogmas. The F4U Corsair provided daily, lethal proof to thousands of individuals that their foundational worldview was fundamentally flawed, demonstrating unequivocally to you and anyone studying this history that sheer willpower and immense courage were entirely useless against an overwhelming industrial apparatus. This brutal narrative of technological determinism, forged in the fires of aerial combat, established that modern warfare is definitively won on assembly lines, rather than through adherence to ancient martial codes. Every surviving pilot internalized and disseminated the same chilling realization that this mechanical onslaught was simply unstoppable, transforming individual battlefield defeats into a profound civilizational awakening. Much like German prisoners of war who arrived on American shores only to be stunned by an unfathomable industrial landscape, you can see how these Pacific aviators discovered they were fighting not merely a better airplane, but the concentrated economic might of a vastly superior civilization. The F4U Corsair endures as a stark historical monument to the reality that fusing advanced technological development with massive manufacturing capacity creates an inescapable formula for military victory. Acting as judge, jury, and executioner for the Imperial Naval Air Fleet, the fighter ruthlessly exposed the inadequacies of their engineering and the fatal obsolescence of their tactical philosophies. Even today, when you attend international air demonstrations and witness meticulously restored examples of these bent-wing fighters gracing the sky, their distinct aerodynamic whistle continues to echo as a haunting reminder of an era when that sound heralded certain destruction. However, for the adversaries who clashed with these machines, the F4U Corsair signifies a much more profound legacy. It functioned as a brutal educator and a shatterer of myths, ultimately demonstrating that contemporary conflicts are dominated by the state possessing superior manufacturing capabilities, rather than the one with the most fearless combatants. The dread that gripped Japanese aviators did not stem from cowardice, but rather from a logical comprehension that they were confronting an insurmountable civilizational juggernaut instead of just a highly advanced aircraft. This profound terror was actually a form of grim enlightenment, born from the devastating realization that everything you had ever believed was fundamentally flawed, and that sacrificing your life would merely underscore your enemy's dominance. Ultimately, this fighter plane accomplished a psychological victory that endless campaigns of psychological warfare never could, instilling a paralyzing apprehension among the pilots about taking to the air. Within that very trepidation sprouted the beginnings of a profound national shift, transitioning a fierce military empire into a tranquil economic giant. This metamorphosis was paid for with the lives of airmen who discovered, tragically late, that raw bravery becomes entirely futile when your opposition completely commands the heavens.